War, like art, finds its masterpiece in ruin. By the closing years of the 15th century, Europe stood on the edge of rebirth and destruction. The Renaissance had gilded cities with beauty, invention, and ambition, but under that veneer of genius beat the same ancient heart of conquest in Italy. The cradle of culture had become the chessboard of kings. Each city-state, Venice, Milan, Florence, Naples, and the Papal States, glimmered with wealth, art, and intrigue. Their armies were filled with mercenaries, their walls adorned with marble, their leaders wrapped in velvet and deception. Yet beyond the Alps, restless monarchs watched and hungered. France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, three giants of ambition, saw in Italy not art but opportunity. To control Italy was to command the wealth of Europe, to hold the center of trade and culture, to dominate the soul of Christendom itself. But their vision would bring an age to its knees. The Italian wars would rage for 65 years, devouring generations, bleeding treasuries dry, and burying the code of chivalry beneath cannon smoke. It began in 1494, when Charles VIII of France, a young and impulsive king, looked southward. Italy was fractured, a mosaic of city-states too wealthy and too proud to unite Milan's ruler. Lodovico Sforza, fearing his rivals in Naples, invited the French king to intervene. It was a decision that would unleash chaos across the peninsula. Charles saw himself not as an invader, but as a liberator, the rightful heir to the kingdom of Naples through a distant dynastic claim. But behind the polite words of legitimacy hid something older, ambition draped in divine right. Charles's army crossed the Alps like a storm of steel and gunpowder. 25,000 men, among them the most modern instruments of war Europe had yet seen, rows of culverins and bombards. Bronze cannons capable of shattering walls, once thought impregnable, rolled southward alongside disciplined infantry and armored cavalry. The knights of France, heirs to centuries of mounted glory, rode in glittering columns, their banners bright against the mountain snows. Yet even they could feel that the world had shifted beneath their hooves. When Charles entered Florence and then Rome, the Italians saw what they had feared and secretly admired: modern war, brutal and efficient. His army moved like a machine, the old feudal levies replaced by professional soldiers and gunners. At Naples, the defenders fell before French artillery with terrifying speed. Castles that once resisted sieges for months crumbled in hours. The age of the sword gave way to the age of the cannon. But Charles's triumph was brief. The Italian states, horrified by their own folly, united against him with foreign powers. The League of Venice, composed of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, and several Italian cities, rose to push him out. In 1495, at Fornovo, French chivalry met Italian cunning. The battle was a blur of mud, steel, and smoke, knights charging through rain and chaos as musketeers fired from behind wagons and walls. For the first time, the proud French cavalry found itself checked not by equal nobility, but by disciplined common soldiers armed with gunpowder and pikes. Charles escaped north, his dreams of an Italian crown turned to ash. Though he returned to France humiliated, his invasion had opened a door that could never be closed. The Italian wars had begun, and every king in Europe would soon march through that same gate. In 1499, Louis XII, Charles's cousin and successor, claimed Milan. The French, masters of heavy cavalry and siege artillery, struck again. This time, their target was not just territory, it was dominance. But in the shifting sands of Italian politics, alliances never lasted. France's enemies adapted quickly, learning to fight not as noble houses but as nations. Spain, under the cunning general Gonzalo Fernandez de Córdoba, soon revealed the next evolution in warfare, one that would render the knight obsolete. De Córdoba, known as El Gran Capitán, understood that cavalry glory belonged to the past. His Spanish army combined pikemen, swordsmen, and arquebusiers, early firearm infantry, into cohesive units that could both hold and strike. In the rugged terrain of southern Italy, these flexible formations outmaneuvered France's proud knights. At Cerignola in 1503, de Córdoba faced the French in open battle. His men dug trenches, placed artillery in fixed positions, and waited behind their pikes and guns. The French knights charged as they always had, banners high, lances leveled, believing courage could crush lead and fire. It was their final illusion. As they thundered forward, the Spanish artillery spoke first, tearing gaps in their ranks. Arquebusiers followed, their crude gunfire filling the air with smoke and screams. The French charge dissolved before it even reached the lines. It was the first battle in history decisively won by small arms and field fortifications. The age of the knight ended at Cerignola. Spain emerged as the new power of Italy, disciplined, calculating, ruthless. Yet France refused to yield. The wars stretched on, morphing with each decade into something more monstrous. The fields of Lombardy and Naples became graveyards of mercenaries. The chivalric oaths of old dissolved into contracts, signed in blood, and gold armies no longer fought for glory. They fought for pay. Behind it all, the Renaissance hummed like a cruel contradiction. While artists painted angels on chapel ceilings, soldiers turned the cobblestones red. Leonardo da Vinci designed machines of beauty and death alike, his sketches showing the same genius applied to cathedrals and cannons. The art of war had become war as art. By 1512, Italy was a chessboard of ruin. Cities changed hands faster than seasons. Popes became generals, kings became gamblers, and no alliance held into this chaos stepped a young French king whose ambition burned hotter than any before him, Francis I. Handsome, cultured, and bold, Francis dreamed not only of conquering Italy but of reviving France's medieval splendor, a return to knightly glory under a Renaissance crown. In 1515, Francis led his army across the Alps and into Lombardy. At Marignano, he faced the feared Swiss mercenaries, the finest infantry of the age. They fought not for chivalry but for coin, wielding pikes longer than men and discipline sharper than any blade. The battle raged for 2 days, brutal, relentless, drenched in sweat and gunpowder. Francis fought among his men, sword in hand, earning his knighthood on the field in the old tradition. Yet even amid his personal valor, the reality of modern war surrounded him. Artillery thundered, muskets cracked, and organized ranks decided the outcome. Not single acts of heroism. France triumphed, but the victory felt hollow. The King of France had won by fire and coordination, not by chivalric duel. The world had changed. What once separated noble from peasant, armor, training, and horse, had become irrelevant. A farm boy with a musket could bring down a knight whose lineage stretched back to Charlemagne. Feudal honor collapsed under the weight of gunpowder and logistics. The Italian wars were not just about land, they were a funeral for a way of life. As the decades dragged on, war itself became industrial. Mercenaries from Germany, Spain, Switzerland, and Italy flooded the fields. Their loyalties shifted with coin, and so did victory. the Landsknechts, German soldiers of fortune, clad in slashed colorful clothing, marched under banners of skulls and saints. Their pikes glittered in the sunlight as they fought for paymasters instead of kings. The distinction between knight and commoner vanished. All men were in a new machinery of death. In 1525, this transformation reached its climax at Pavia, one of the most decisive battles in European history. Francis I, still chasing his Italian crown, faced the Spanish imperial army of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, a man who ruled more of the world than any since Rome. The French king commanded the flower of his nobility. Glittering knights, proud banners, all the symbols of chivalric France. Charles's army, by contrast, was a creation of the New Age, pikemen, musketeers, and cannons working as one organism. The morning mist over Pavia soon turned to smoke. The French cavalry charged, elegant and doomed, their armor flashing in the dawn. Spanish arquebusiers fired in coordinated volleys, cutting through the charge like a scythe. Cannonballs tore through ranks once thought invincible. Within hours, the French army was broken. Francis himself was captured, a king brought low by the very technology he had once underestimated. In his cell, Francis wrote to his mother, "All is lost except honor." But even honor had changed meaning. The capture of a king should have ended the fighting. Instead, it ignited something darker. Francis I's defeat at Pavia did not bring peace. It broke the illusion that war could ever again be guided by honor. The crown of France ransomed its monarch, paid its debts in gold and humiliation, and prepared for another campaign. Across the Alps, Emperor Charles V, ruler of Spain, Germany, and the New World, stood astride half the globe, yet could barely control the armies that fought in his name. Mercenaries filled his ranks, loyal only to coin, and coin was running out. When soldiers go unpaid, discipline dies first. In 1527, the imperial army, hungry and furious, turned its eyes toward the richest prize in Europe, Rome. The eternal city, heart of faith and art, was unguarded and glimmering. Among the invaders marched Spanish veterans, German Landsknechts in torn, bright slashes of cloth, and Italian turncoats seeking plunder. They carried muskets instead of banners, desperation instead of devotion. As dawn rose on the 6th of May, 1527, the city's walls shook under cannon fire. The defenders were outnumbered 20-1. Soon the gates splintered, and civilization itself seemed to collapse. Churches burned. Cardinals were dragged through streets once walked by emperors. Smoke from the Sistine Chapel blotted the sky. For 8 days, Rome, the soul of Christendom, was ravaged by the very soldiers sworn to protect it. It was not merely a sack, it was a requiem for the Middle Ages. The papal banners fell beside broken statues of saints, and among the ruins, faith itself looked mortal. Painters and poets later called it divine punishment. Historians knew better. It was logistics, hunger, and gunpowder, the cold arithmetic of modern war. From that moment, the Italian wars ceased to be chivalric rivalry and became pure survival. The armies that fought afterward were no longer noble crusaders. They were instruments of national will. Spain fielded professional tercios, rectangular formations mixing pikemen and arquebusiers that could withstand cavalry and crush infantry alike. These blocks of steel and discipline moved like fortresses across open fields, their coordination turning chaos into geometry. France answered with reform of its own. No longer could valor compensate for structure. The French crown built permanent standing armies, standardized weapons, and improved artillery foundries. Cannons grew lighter, faster to reload, more precise. Cities responded with bastioned walls. Angular star-shaped defenses designed to deflect iron shot. War became engineering. Italy, once the stage, became the victim. Its wealth drew armies like flies to honey. Its people learned that genius offered no protection from powder and steel. The great Italian condottieri, mercenary captains who had once dictated battles like duels, found themselves obsolete. A cannonball ignored their lineage. A volley of lead did not pause for parley. Through the 1530s and 1540s, the peninsula traded masters. The Valois kings of France and the Habsburg emperors of Spain signed truces, broke them, and returned with new inventions. Each time, pike squares stretched longer, muskets fired faster, and supply chains extended farther. Battles grew less about courage and more about endurance. Which nation could feed its soldiers longer, pay its mercenaries faster, or replace its dead quicker? Amid this evolution stood one constant figure, Charles V himself, emperor in title, prisoner of circumstance. His dominion spanned continents, from the silver mines of the Americas to the cathedrals of Vienna. Yet every corner demanded blood and gold. To hold Italy, he needed both, and both were finite. By 1544, exhausted, Charles sought peace with his rival Francis, who had aged into the same disillusion. They met not as knights, but as administrators of exhaustion, signing treaties no one trusted. When Francis I died in 1547, his son Henry II inherited the throne and the obsession. Henry despised the Habsburgs as hereditary tyrants, but even his youthful fire could not rekindle the romance of war. By now, Europe fought behind smoke and formations. The duel had given way to drill. At St. Quentin, 1557, and Gravelines, 1558, Spanish tercios proved unstoppable, their ranks moving with inhuman precision. Cavalry charges shattered like waves on rock. Knights still rode, but now they were symbols, gilded ghosts galloping through musket smoke. Art recorded the truth the poets ignored. Painters depicted battles not as heroic tableaux, but as infernos of confusion. Walls collapsing, lines blurring, faces lost behind helmets. Chroniclers wrote less of virtue, more of powder stores and debt ledgers. The Renaissance had taught humanity to measure everything. The Italian wars applied that precision to killing. By the Peace of Cateau Cambrésis in 1559, the long nightmare ended where it had begun, in negotiation rather than victory. Spain emerged dominant, its disciplined armies unmatched, its coffers nearly empty. France licked its wounds, its nobility diminished, its peasants bled dry. Italy remained divided, a stage stripped of scenery. The papacy, once the arbiter of kings, now watched monarchs redraw maps without asking heaven's permission. Yet amid ruin, something new had been born. Out of the smoke rose the modern state, centralized, bureaucratic, and permanently armed. The professional soldier replaced the noble warrior. The engineer replaced the knight-errant. The concepts of supply, logistics, and national interest began to eclipse honor, faith, and vengeance. The Renaissance humanist wrote of man's potential. The captain calculated his range tables. The knight did not vanish overnight. He lingered, ceremonial and decorative, attending tournaments that mimicked wars already impossible. But his battlefield had moved from earth to memory. The cannon had silenced the trumpet. When chroniclers later spoke of the Italian wars, they called them the laboratory of modern combat. Here, armor cracked and tactics hardened. Here, Europe learned that courage could not stop chemistry, that steel was no match for saltpeter. The wars had lasted 65 years, cost uncounted lives, and left no glory to the victors, only lessons. One lesson above all: war favors the organized, not the noble. As the 16th century waned, veterans of Italy carried its teachings across the world. Spanish soldiers sailed to the Americas, bringing their tercios to new continents. French officers reformed their armies for the religious wars to come. German mercenaries sold their discipline to whoever could pay. The techniques born in Lombardy and Naples would echo in Flanders, the Netherlands, and the New World, the blueprint of empire drawn in Italian dust. And so the peninsula that had birthed Rome and the Renaissance became once more the teacher of Europe, not in art this time, but in annihilation. The final canon of Cateau Cambrésis fell silent, but its echo carried for centuries. It whispered through the drill yards of Prussia, the squares of Waterloo, the trenches of Flanders, and the mechanized fields of the future. Every regiment marching in formation owed something to the chaos of Milan, Naples, and Rome. The Italian wars had not just ended the age of knights, they had forged the modern world. When the smoke finally cleared, Europe stood reborn, scarred, but certain. The age of castles and codes had ended. In its place rose a continent of fortresses, arsenals, and bureaucrats who could calculate destruction as easily as a merchant tallies coin. The Italian wars were more than a contest of kings. They were the turning of a hinge in history. No single battle announced it. It crept forward, through trenches dug at Cerignola, through gunfire that felled nobles beside peasants, through the endless sieges that measured courage in days of rations instead of duels of honor. The knight had been unseated not by cowardice, but by progress. Iron and intellect replaced lineage and faith. The men who survived these campaigns returned home changed. They spoke not of crusades or miracles, but of supply lines, munitions, and paymasters. Their children would fight under flags instead of family crests. Where once a knight carried a coat of arms, a soldier now bore a regimental number. The difference seemed small until one realized it marked the birth of nations. Italy, once the jewel of Europe, wore its ruin like a crown of thorns. Its cathedrals still reached heaven, but its fields were sown with cannonballs. Yet from that devastation came a new vision. Painters captured the terror they had seen. Philosophers wrote of power, reason, and order. Machiavelli, hardened by Florence's defeats, distilled war and politics into cold mathematics. His prince became the scripture of modern rulers, proof that virtue alone could not guard a throne. Across the Alps, generals studied the campaigns as if reading scripture of their own. The tercio formations that marched through Lombardy would evolve into regiments, brigades, and divisions. Europe's armies now moved not as mobs, but as mechanisms. Drums replaced trumpets, and orders replaced oaths. The old words, honor, gallantry, glory, remained in poetry, but on the field they had lost weight. Courage was still required, but it had become a component, not a compass. The Italian wars had proven that the battlefield no longer rewarded the boldest man, but the best plan. And yet, even as innovation conquered tradition, something of the knight endured. The human need to see purpose in conflict, to wrap violence in ideals, refused to die. Each new weapon, musket, cannon, tank, drone, was born from the same desire that drove a man in armor to lower his lance. The tools changed, the will did not. By the middle of the 16th century, Europe's kings ruled through gunpowder and paper. Armies became institutions, wars became policies. The Renaissance, that flowering of mind and art, had also perfected the machinery of death. It was the cruel symmetry of progress. The same hand that painted the Sistine ceiling could design the trajectory of a cannonball. For 65 years, the Italian wars turned beauty into battlefield, and when they ended, the world could never return to what it had been. The echo of their gunfire rolled through centuries, across the thunder of Napoleonic drums, the crack of rifles at Verdun, the whine of engines over Normandy. Each was an evolution, but all were descendants of that first artillery barrage that shattered a knight's charge outside Naples. In the chronicles of conquest, this chapter stands as the moment when war became modern. Strategy replaced ceremony. States replaced saints, and the horse gave way to the cannon. Yet beneath the machinery, the same heart beats. Pride, fear, ambition, the eternal trinity that marches beside every army, survived unbroken. The weapons may change their shape, but the story remains the same. So when the final scene fades, the smoke over Lombardy clearing to reveal broken armor half buried in the mud, it is not just an ending, it is a mirror. The death of the knight was the birth of us. The world that calculates, innovates, and conquers with logic instead of legend. The age of chivalry died in Italy, but its ghost still rides every battlefield. And as long as humanity wages war, that ghost will never rest.